Hello, I'm Pedro Mora with Pacific Media from the Pacific coast of Canada. Today, we look at the old struggle between those who want to fix capitalism every time it gets into crisis and those who want to build a new economic system independent of capitalism. Professor Gary Teeple and Professor Marting Hart-Landsberg explain this dilemma.
Because clearly, with the election of Thatcher and Reagan, the attempt to reverse the policies of the welfare state began in earnest in 1970, 1980, as capital attempted to effectively return to higher profit margins. So there was the beginning of a relentless attack on workers' rights, on trade union rights, a rollback in pensions and wages, all through this period. And effectively, they all constitute attacks on Keynesianism, on the welfare state, on working people everywhere. Those decades were marked by the successes of capital and frequent defeats of the working class, although the resistance was constant and there all along. But nevertheless, there was a slow degradation of the rights and the assets and the ability of the working class to resist. Capital, almost as if drunk on their excesses and their successes, moved from one crisis to another. So this whole period is a period marked by crises, replete with criminal acts on the part of capital at all levels. Finally, by 2008, actually leading in clearly 2007, but 2008, 2009, the excess has led to a crash in their excess and their criminality that nearly brought the world economy to its knees. Now, in order to save themselves from themselves, capital moved in two directions. One was to insist that the state, or to use the state as a means of bailing them out, that is, by effectively going into enormous debt. In other words, socializing their own bankruptcy. And the other means was to effectively further or accelerate the attack on workers' rights, on pensions, on the whole social security system that workers, certainly in the industrial world, had enjoyed. But to save itself by socializing its bankruptcy and by accelerating the retrenchment of the working class, capital only further threatened the whole system by creating a downward spiral of declining economic growth. So to save itself, in fact, it was threatening the system that gave it life. Moreover, as far as the working class was concerned, it put the working class into a position to have to save itself from the depredations of capital. So initially, as I said, the working class throughout the latter part of the 20th century, early part of the 21st century, always hoped for a return to the Keynesian compromise, a kind of revitalization of social reform. But the configuration of forces after World War II that gave rise to Keynesianism are no more, and there really is no possibility of those forces returning, of that configuration returning. So the retrenchment that the working class has experienced over the last 3 decades has taught them an enormous amount, and this is partly what we want to explore today. And it's taught them that this is a system that cannot address their needs, that actually has no future for the working class as such. It has taught the working class that, in fact, if it's to save itself, it has to save itself by transforming the system. So here you have the contradiction, the capitalist class trying to save itself, but in the process effectively destroying the system that gives it life. And the working class now forced to save itself and beginning to understand that to save itself it has to transform the system. Now there is one way out that capital can go in order to save itself, but only temporarily, and that is, of course, by increasing the possibility of war. Professor Landsberg is a professor of economics and a director of the political economy program at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. Marty, as he goes by. Teachers and researchers in political economy, economic development, international economics, and the politics and economics of Asia. He has a forthcoming book called Capitalist Globalization, Consequences and Alternatives. I guess that's a monthly review. That's 2013. That's next year, or in a matter of months, I guess. He has been here before. He has stimulated us with his lectures in the past. And we are looking forward very much to further stimulation in this talk from Marting Hart-Landsberg. I give you.
Let me just start my talk with sort of an obvious point, which is that we live in a time marked by growing national and international imbalances, instabilities, and inequities. What's not so well understood by most people, unfortunately, is the connection between these threats to our well-being and contemporary capitalist dynamics. Obviously, capitalism is not a static system. The twin levers that generally drive its motion are competition and class struggle. And these levers and their complex interactions generate pressures and contradictions that compel profit-seeking capitalists to continually reorganize their activities. And this, of course, is a process that has profound consequences for us. In other words, to a large extent, our social condition is shaped by actions of the leading business organizations of the time. Today, these leading business organizations are transnational corporations. And as I want to sort of argue, their drive for profit has produced a new, more globalized stage of world capitalism, one shaped by accumulation dynamics that are directly responsible for generating the imbalances, instabilities, and inequities that threaten our well-being. Most importantly, this means that the economic and social challenges we face have deep structural underpinnings. And as a consequence, in line with what Gary was saying, what that means is that efforts at reform which accept the logic of existing patterns of economic activity will just be incapable of satisfying our pressing needs for meaningful social change. So let me start with transnational corporations. These are more than just large companies with a global reach. They now organize an incredibly large percentage of global economic activity. According to a recent World Bank, UN publication, transnational corporations accounted for about $16 trillion in value added in 2010, or about a quarter of global GDP. Their foreign affiliates accounted for a third of world exports. And they're not just large corporations that are the most powerful in their own countries. Increasingly, the top 100 transnational corporations, non-financial ones, the majority, about 60% of their assets, sales, and employment is outside their home country. For all transnational corporations alone, their value added of their foreign affiliates has gone up from about 30% in 2005 to 40% in 2010. This stage, beginning in the mid-1980s, was marked by a sharp acceleration in foreign direct investment. In fact, foreign direct investment grew far more rapidly in the 1980s than world trade and world output, and basically became the engine of world growth. Between 1983 and 1989, foreign direct investment grew at a compound annual rate of growth of about 30%, compared to trade of about 10% and GDP growth of about 8%. When you think about this, it highlights the inadequacies of using a nation-state framework for understanding how global capitalism operates. In the case of China, looking at the iPhone and its sales to the United States, you say, oh, they're running a $2 billion trade surplus with the United States. If you acknowledge that most of that iPhone value was produced outside of China, China's net value surplus with the United States was $73 million. In short, although national accounting implies that China, this national country, is this major exporter to the United States, another nation, with China the big winner and the U.S. the big loser, in reality, the profit generated by the production and sale of iPhones was captured by a few select transnational corporations, none of which are Chinese, and Apple, the U.S. company, is the biggest winner. The successful expansion of these global dynamics has depended heavily on the creation of what a lot of people call a new international architecture, which is capable of providing the long-term economic security that transnational capital needs when it expands these cross-border networks. This architecture was largely built by state action, in particular, specifically state-negotiated international trade and investment agreements, and secondarily, national regulatory changes. And I think the fact that a diverse group of states continue to pursue these agreements, these free trade investment agreements, that significantly limit their own authority over economic activity, highlights the fact that there really is a common class interest shared by transnational capital that transcends national and competitive differences. Now, these multinational but increasingly bilateral investment and trade agreements do a lot of things that are important for capital, transnational capital. It means that import and export goods can move free from tariff and non-tariff barriers. Very important if you're going to be moving components back and forth. It allows transnational capital to move funds free from capital controls and financial restrictions. It allows them to invest without fear of performance requirements, including those that might require them to transfer technology, merge or form alliances with local enterprises, hire local employees, pursue and purchase local inputs. They don't have to do that. They don't have to worry that host governments might nationalize or restrict their operations. The area of the world where these agreements have exploded has been, not surprisingly, in East Asia, because East Asia has become the focal point for where most of these cross-border production networks are actually lodged. Although, while they're most intense in Asia, every region in the world, governments are eagerly signing these kinds of agreements. And I won't take time to go through all the changes that have been documented in country after country, national changes to make it easier for transnational corporations to operate, set up investment, be free of performance requirements, have access to different sectors of production. Because what's happened is East Asia has become knitted together by these transnational production networks to focus their attention on producing parts and components in this integrated process that ends in China, with China being the premier export platform for the region. And so what's happened in East Asia is that East Asian countries no longer export finished products, and in particularly so much directly to developed capitalist countries anymore. They export now parts and components to each other, and especially to China. And China, which used to export more to East Asia, doesn't export to East Asia much. It exports primarily to Japan, Europe, the United States, Canada, other places. It's become the export focus. Because China has become so important in terms of other countries now selling their products to China, people have often argued, oh, China can now replace the US, anchor an alternative pole, because for most countries in East Asia and even in the world, in the third world, they're exporting primarily to China. But the fact is that China doesn't exist as an independent market for those goods and services. They're parts and components, and what that means is that the world is now integrated more tightly into an export-driven process that relies still on the purchasing power of the European Union, Canada, United States, and Japan. Now, while this international production has been a very profitable strategy for transnational capital, it's generated enormous trade imbalances that have become, and as Gary said, are now understood as increasingly unsustainable. And the poles that have been created here are China as the largest final producer and the US as the largest final consumer. In 2006, the US accounted for 50% of aggregate current account deficits in the world economy, meaning importing more than they exported. And China accounted for, in its national accounting, about 25% of aggregate current account surpluses. Now, this relationship means, in a sense, that the China-US trade thing is very important. US ran a deficit with China of about $11 billion in 1990, $274 billion in 2007. China provides for the US something like 40% of all of its information and communication technology imports. Just a huge percent of goods. Again, coming from East Asia. From 1999 to 2007, China's share of US trade deficit rose from 20% to 32%. Over the same period, Japan and the rest of East Asia's share of the U.S. trade deficit fell by the same amount. Instead of these other countries continuing to sell to the U.S., they're selling to China parts and components, and China's the one selling. So China becomes the face of a whole transnational corporate structure. And so you begin to understand the fragility of the world economy, because how were U.S. households buying so much of this? U.S. personal consumption as a share of U.S. GDP grew from like 66 to almost 71% of GDP over the period from the late 90s to 2007, largely financed by this housing bubble, which enabled consumers to borrow an enormous amount of money, sustaining their consumption despite declining living standards. The collapse of the housing bubble and the resulting financial crisis has meant that U.S. consumers are no longer capable of supporting that kind of growth. And there's no other country capable of replacing the U.S. Annual household consumption in the U.S. has averaged about $10 trillion. In Japan, $2.5 trillion. In Germany, less than $2 trillion. And both Germany and Japan are export countries that are not interested in boosting consumption, which would weaken exports. China has consumption of 1/8 of the United States, and most of China's consumption doesn't require imports. So the point is that this world economy has now structured in such a way that it's very unstable. Investment as a share of GDP in China rose from 39% in 2007 to 46% by 2010, and it's now, as of last year, 50% of GDP is now investment. But it's very unstable. This is not a strategy that China can long sustain, and China's growth is already slowing, and people are predicting that within a few years its growth rate is going to be down to 3 or 4% rather than the 8, 9, 10% it was. So first, the negative consequences of contemporary accumulation dynamics are that it's created this unbalanced and unstable global production and consumption relations. But equally important, perhaps even more important, is that while these dynamics have greatly benefited transnational corporations and the national allies that are aligned with them, they've been enormously costly for working people, including in these countries that appear to be the beneficiaries. Despite this rapid export growth in China, maybe you know this, but the number of Chinese manufacturing workers has actually declined. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics has looked at total manufacturing employment in China and found that from 1994 to 2006, it actually fell by over 7 million. China isn't stealing jobs. The process of accumulation in China is throwing out workers through intense speed-ups, capital intensity, and declines of many domestic production. Urban manufacturing employment, where foreign capital is most centered, the decline in manufacturing employment there went from 55 million to 33 million, a decline of 20 million in urban manufacturing. And it's not just manufacturing. Studies by the International Labor Organization that looked at total urban employment in China found that from 1990 to 2002, almost all the growth in urban employment was in irregular work, by which they mean construction, cleaning, maintenance of premises, retail trade, street vending, repair services, domestic services, not jobs that were in regulated labor markets. To be specific, total urban employment over the period 1990 to 2002 grew by 81.7 million. 80 million of that growth was in irregular employment. And it's not just low wages that attract multinationals to China, it's also the broader work environment, a work environment where transnational corporations have tremendous control over things. New York Times had a story about Apple, why they love China, and this is a quote from the Times quoting one of their managers. One former Apple executive described how the company relied upon a Chinese factory to revamp iPhone manufacturing weeks before the device was due to shelves. Apple would redesign the iPhone screen at the last minute, forcing an assembly line overhaul. New screens began arriving at the plant near midnight. A foreman immediately aroused 8,000 workers inside the company's dormitories, according to the executive. Each employee was given a biscuit and a cup of tea, guided to a workstation, and within half an hour started a 12-hour shift fitting glass screens into beveled frames. Within 96 hours, the plant was producing over 10,000 iPhones a day. The speed and flexibility is breathtaking, the executive said. So a policy to create relatively low wages, a tightly controlled and disciplined work environment is particularly attractive. But it's not just affecting China, because China's key position in this border production network means that transnational corporations are judging investment in every other country in East Asia relative to China. So in Korea, before 2000, regular workers accounted for 60% of the workforce, irregular workers 40%. It's now been reversed. 60% of South Korean workers are now irregular workers. They now refer to irregular factories. And irregular workers make about 50% of what regular workers make in monthly earnings. So this production system, where we look at East Asia and say, oh, these countries are doing so well, the pressures and processes have been enormous and an enormous cost. And so has it been on the other end of this line, which is the United States. The U.S. also went through a major transformation around 1979, just like China did, 78, 79, when its reform started. U.S. corporations began this foreign direct investment, facing profit squeezes from German and Japanese exports. And as wages were rising in the U.S. and the labor movement was making some gains, the state in the United States took action to try and make U.S. more competitive with this. They succeeded in basically attacking unions, doing away with social programs, driving down wages, working conditions. They didn't literally improve the situation for competitiveness, but they certainly did boost corporate profits. But this combination of declining wages in the United States and a growing trade deficit gave rise to finance as the country's dominant corporate sector. The decline in wages in the 80s led workers to begin to borrow more. Credit cards started to explode in terms of debt. And the U.S. trade deficit, the other side of that, was huge dollar earnings, which came back into the U.S. to be invested. And so U.S. finance began to benefit from both ends of this process. Workers who needed to borrow to sustain living standards, and the huge trade deficits which were now being generated by this global production network which U.S. firms participated in, creating deficits and dollars that can become invested back in the country. Profits are restored, not so much growth, and growth in the U.S. didn't get really invigorated until the mid-90s, when you had the first bubbles of stock market bubble and then housing bubble, pushed up household wealth and touched off a massive consumer boom. The collapse of the housing bubble wiped out household wealth, as well as many loans and financial assets based on housing values, and the result has been the Great Recession in the United States. Almost all the job growth from 1990 to 2008 in the United States came in the non-tradable sector. Specifically, there was 27.3 million increase in total employment, and 98% of that increase took place in the non-tradable sector. Okay, that's from 1990 to 2008. In the non-tradable sector, the two biggest areas of job growth were government and healthcare. And of course, both of those depend on public spending. And with the austerity push now in the United States, essentially state and local government spending, employment in the United States is plummeting, healthcare, all these kinds of problems. People don't have the ability to have healthcare. So this is going to create big problems moving forward. A meaningful recovery is going to require a major restructuring of the U.S. economy. And this determination on the part of U.S. elites to stay the course, despite the crisis, is also visible in East Asia, with similar consequences for working people there. East Asia's export dependence in the rest of the world means there's going to be serious problems for East Asia and the rest of the world that's dependent on this. And a lot of analysts say, just like they do in the United States, there's a simple answer to these problems. In East Asia, they say, just start paying workers more and raise their wages and invest in healthcare and all these other things. Well, such policies are just as unacceptable to those in power in East Asia as suggestions of bank nationalization, public works programs, aggressive industrial policy, labor law reform are to elites in the United States. The top Chinese leaders have been raking in huge profits. In fact, the richest 70 members of China's legislature added more to their wealth last year, which was than the combined net worth. So in 1 year, 2010 to 2011, they added more to their wealth, the top 70, than the total net worth of all 535 members of the U.S. Congress. they added 89 billion. And it's not easy to just turn a switch. And why are they unlikely to do this? It's not just short-run financial gains. You can't suddenly say that all the production networks that cross borders to produce iPhones and iPads can suddenly solve and respond to the demands of working people in these countries. There are, in concrete, factories and technologies and firm interests that you can't just change. You can't just say, oh, well, we'll just start raising wages of Chinese workers and they'll start buying those products. As if, even to the say, whether do we want that consumption pattern? So we can't predict the obvious, with any certainty here of the course of capitalist globalization, but it's pretty clear that the structure in place responds to real corporate interests, that it's knitted together the world economy in very specific ways, and those specific ways have created these huge imbalances and now huge instabilities, at the same time huge costs for working people in all these countries. And now with Europe in crisis, it's hard to say how easily they can even manage these things. Regardless, it's very clear they're not interested in transforming them because this is where their wealth is and this is the structure, and it's not a short-term question of a little more money or a little more here or there. Now, the political consequences have yet to be determined. To the extent that workers continue to think in national terms, they can easily get pitted. We've got to sacrifice more because those Chinese are doing this, and the Koreans, stealing jobs and so on and so forth, in which case it's going to be bad, right? Or people can come by exchanging experiences and come to understand the commonalities. Even in countries where supposedly capitalism is most successful, like China or Korea, workers are suffering declining quality of life. And if we come to understand that, we have a much better chance of responding constructively in the challenge that Gary laid out to us in saying, how do we build a new structure? Not to reform this, which isn't reformable, but to transform it. Still, unfortunately, at this point, what we have to say is the political impetus still remains in the hands of transnational capital. And they have clear interests and clear struggles. And so for us, the challenge is to acknowledge the war on workers and to acknowledge who the enemy is, the system, and to begin to share our experiences and develop our confidence that this is not a system that's going to be responsive to us, that our challenge is to build something radically new. So, thank you.
Professor Marting Hart-Landsberg explained the inherent problems of economic growth and how detrimental global capitalism is to global labor. He suggests that we need to build a new economic system independent of capitalism. Similarly, this little booklet, Perpetual Direct Democracy, published by Amazon.com, suggests that we need to build a new political system independent of monarchy, political parties, and representative political leaders. At a moment of political maturity, we the citizens will decide to take full responsibility of all our own political decisions. I am Pedro Mora.